And so David is Professor of Botany at the University of New South Wales. He leads a number of research teams on how to manage fire regimes for biodiversity conservation and imperiled species. He works on combating myrtle rust, which we all know is a significant risk to our plants, and prioritising rainforest and other ecosystems that are damaged by bushfires. We've asked him to share his insights today on those topics and really provide the context for the whole conference, past, present, future, of Australian flora. So please join me in welcoming Professor David Keith to the stage.
Thanks so much. It's really nice to be here, and thanks so much for the invitation. And I have to tell you that it's a special pleasure because I used to come right here for holidays with my parents when I was a kid. We used to stay just over the road, and we did that year after year after year. So it kind of feels like coming home. And speaking of which, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on Dharawal land and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So let's get on. Past, present, and future. Let's start with the past. So when you look at Australia's place in the world, and you look at it, from this kind of perspective, this is a very crude map of different biomes around the world. There's nothing that special about Australia. It's got deserts, but so have lots of other places: Africa, South America, Central Asia. It's got forests, it's got savannas, which are pretty common in other parts of the world. So there's some similarities, I guess, with where we are with other parts of the world, but also some differences. Here's a man who was struck by some of the differences. He was a traveller in the 1820s and 30s. And landed here for the first time in Australia in 1832, and this is what he said: "A gay and brilliant aspect from the profusion of flowering shrubs and plants strewed over the arid soil. There was, however," and this is my favourite bit, "a peculiar character in the vegetation, the foliage of the trees having a dry appearance and being destitute of the lustre so observable in other countries." I'd take that as a compliment. And I actually have that slide. I show it to my students each year, and it provides a bit of a springboard to talk about all sorts of interesting stuff about the ecology of vegetation in Australia. Just coming back to some of the global context issues, one of the things that you don't see from that previous map is that there's actually a really strong distinction between Northern Hemisphere and Southern Hemisphere. And, there are characteristic, Northern Hemisphere families like, the Betulaceae and the northern beeches and so on, faguses, the ashes, and of course the pines, that really don't occur. They don't make it down to the Southern Hemisphere. And instead, in the Southern Hemisphere, we have families like the Proteaceae, and lots of others, including the Restianaceae and quite a few others that are perhaps a little less well known. So there's actually not a lot of genera in particular shared between the northern and southern hemispheres, but there's also major patterns in the families as well. And one example to pick on out of the many that one could are the southern beeches, Nothofagus, which is a genus of 43 species that are still with us at the moment, and a much larger number that have gone extinct over the millennia and millions of years, actually, tens of millions of years. And it has this interesting southern hemisphere distribution starting from New Guinea and running down through the subtropical eastern Australia, down to Tasmania, New Zealand and South America. And we know from fossil evidence that it was once widespread in the Antarctic as well, before the ice sheet came and enveloped the land there. And these patterns were a great fascination to 19th century biologists, and one of the greats is J.D. Hooker, shown here. And he spent a lot of time pondering, how these patterns emerged. And his suggestion was that, historically, these fragments that we saw, for example, in the beach distribution across all these separate, widely separated southern landmasses, were the upshot of some previous connection. And he postulated that there must have been some kind of land bridge or connection between these landmasses at some time in the past. And this was in 1860, he was talking about this sort of stuff. And it's since become known in modern biogeography as vicariance theory. He had a very close friend, who perhaps is a little bit better known, Charles Darwin. And one of the points that they really had a fairly vigorous disagreement on was this origin. And Darwin's notion was actually that, that was preposterous, that all of these land masses must have been connected. And so therefore, things, plants and other organisms must have spread from some kind of centre of origin to other parts of the world. And so we have these two sort of theories that are kind of opposing, that try to explain, the current patterns from processes in the past. And they've provided fabulous fodder for all kinds of discussion and investigations ever since, and still going on today. There's one more player in this, and that's this weatherman, Alfred Wegener, who was, I think, Austrian or German, perhaps. And he suggested, well, actually, there probably was a connection between continents, because, look, they fit together really nicely, and actually a little bit more deeply than that, they share lots of fossils with one another that seem to be from around about the same era. And that was an idea that he put forward in 1915. It was published, and he was a meteorologist by training and profession, and he was absolutely pilloried for that notion. That was just heresy. Crazy stuff. And that went on for decades, and he basically disappeared into history. I think he died in the 1930s, and silly idea really. Until the 1950s, when this guy came along, Harry Hess. He was an American, and he had the benefit of the technology of the day, and with ships like this, they did some sonar surveys of the and magnetic surveys of the ocean floor, and it became apparent that there were these, mountain ranges underneath the ocean. And there were interesting patterns in the magnetism of the rocks. Anyway, to cut a long story short, Harry put all this data together and discovered that the rocks seem to get older and older the further away that you go from these mountain ranges. And there was volcanism associated with these mountain ranges, and lo and behold, they were centres or seams, if you like, where new Earth's crust was created, emerging from the magma below and spreading. And the corollary of that is that the continents and land masses that are sitting on top of all this must be moving around as new ocean floor is created, and pushes continents apart. And the flip side is that there are these other seams called subduction zones where older rocks disappear back down into the centre of the Earth. So there we had a piece of evidence from hard data that actually confirmed Wegener's jigsaw puzzle proposition that was so pilloried for decades and decades. And that made biologists who had actually been the first to suggest this back in Hooker's time take on a whole new perspective on the past. And since then, we've been able to come up with a fairly well-dated chronology of the configuration of land masses around the world, and starting with a configuration where Gondwana there in the pink 150 million years ago comprised primarily Australia and Antarctica, Africa, South America, and not to forget Madagascar and India, and that split up in a particular sequence, with Africa and Madagascar and India departing first from the rest, and the final connection that broke was the one between South America and the Antarctic. So Australia parted ways with the rest of Gondwana around about 30 million years ago was the final link, I think, or actually no, it may have been a little earlier than that. But because of that, we can now put together a biological clock to match the geological one, and with new technology that's emerged with understanding of genes and their molecular characteristics, we can actually date hereditary trees or phylogenetic trees that show the relationships between different groups of plants and animals and humans and everything that's lived, really. It's basically the same technique that can be used to reconstruct these family trees, or phylogenetic trees as they're known. And the important advance that's happened in the last couple of decades is that we can actually date the vertical axis of these family trees and put some time frames on how long ago different genera and different species actually diverged from one another. So there's been a lot of work. It's not really my discipline, but there's been a lot of work, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a moment. But just coming back to this dispersal versus vicariance dichotomy or debate, if you want to call it that, we can think about that in relation to every single group of plants, as long as we can get some data on their relationships. And so the obvious question to ask is this pattern that we see today in the present the product of some dispersal processes in the past? Did these Nothofagus originate, somewhere in Australia perhaps, and then disperse elsewhere? Or did they predate that and go right back to Gondwana and basically disperse as those land masses broke up and went their separate ways, in line with Hooker's vicariance theory? The evidence, and bear with me here, these are fragments or parts of the phylogenetic tree that's been developed with lots of morphological and molecular data on Nothofagus, including some of the fossil data that we have for taxa or species that are no longer with us. And you'll see on the right-hand side there's two fragments in the bottom panels there that represent different smaller groups of beech trees. And the top panel is the geological data. So that tells us when the different land masses actually separated physically. So you'll see that Australia and New Guinea were the last to become isolated from one another, and that was quite recent. And that New Zealand and New Caledonia actually separated from Australia a long, long time ago. What is it there, 70 million years or something. And Australia actually maintained its connection with the Antarctic and South America for a much longer period. So if we go along with that and follow vicariance, then the Australian Nothofagus should have closer relatives in South America than they do in New Zealand. And to some degree, we do see that, but every now and then there's an anomaly. And there's one of those anomalies right here, Nothofagus menzesii, which is one of the New Zealand beeches. And there it is, sitting closely related to Australian taxa, the myrtle beech from Victoria and Tasmania, and Nothofagus morii, which is the one we have here in northern New South Wales. And the relatives from South America are, apparently diverged much earlier, around about 42 million years ago. So the 42 million year figure is reasonably consistent with the breaking up of Australia from South America and the Antarctic. But the New Zealand relationship to those Australian species is actually much younger than we would expect from vicariance alone. So that tells us that in that particular case there's been a dispersal event. Some Nothofagus from Australia, perhaps Tasmania or Victoria, has gone across to the New Zealand landmass, and some recent advances in knowledge have actually suggested that there was a time when virtually all of New Zealand was underwater. And so if that was the case, then whatever its land-based or terrestrial flora at that time, it would not have survived. So we're now very certain that there's been some dispersal from Australia to New Zealand, which without people seems like a very long way indeed. But let's go and have a look at some other examples, and the big one for us is Proteaceae, but there's lots of others. And when you look across the entire family tree for the whole family of Proteaceae, there's actually 8 international disjunctions, they're called, where species are related to one another that come from different continents. And to cut a long story short, the relationships for half of those, 4 out of the 8, can be explained by vicariance, and the other 4 can only be explained by dispersal. One of the examples of a very nice vicariant relationship is this guy here, the Waratahs, which is part of a larger group called the Embothriinae, and they're distributed in New Caledonia as well as Australia and South America and so on. And that is a very nice fit for vicariance. The relationships match up very nicely with what we know about the geology. But there are others that don't fit that at all, including some that must have involved some dispersal between Africa and Australia, which is even further than from Australia to New Zealand. And when you think about that, that's really quite incredible. How can something with a seed the size of Proteaceae, which some of the smaller ones are Petrophilus and Conospermums, for example, and that's the group that seems to have dispersed. How on earth can it get all that way? You presume that they wouldn't survive in seawater for very long, and we still really don't know the answer to that, but all I can say is that we're learning a lot about vortices, which are patterns of wind that, like cyclones or willy-willies on a smaller scale, that can take material up into the upper atmosphere. And there's a greater probability, some work's shown quite recently that we've been involved in, shown that the probability of having those vortices actually increases after fire because of the differential in temperature between the ground surface, which heats up because it's black, and the upper atmosphere. And so that's potentially one mechanism that plants can move a very long way, even if they're rather heavy seeds. There are others, of course. We know, for example, that birds carry moss spores and probably other plant material on their feathers from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And there's reasonably good evidence for that. So incredible as it may seem, that seems to have happened. But the other thing that we need to keep in mind is that it's pretty unlikely, but it doesn't have to happen very often. And for it to happen 4 times in the 100 million year history, that's lots of generations. And so even unlikely events can have deep consequences. And I couldn't resist one more example. I won't bore you with too many more of these, but Triodia or the porcupine grass, hummock grass, is, or spinifex it's sometimes known, covers an enormous area of arid Australia, and that map up there is just where hummock grasses are dominant. They've actually got a wider distribution than that, and they occur as subdominance in other kinds of communities, including the mallee and some of the woodlands in northwestern New South Wales. But we know that this particular group from the molecular work is too young to have been here already when Australia separated from Asia, which is where its closest relatives are in Central Asia. And so that also must have been a migrant from, and they've been able to date it with a molecular clock somewhere between 14 and 24 million years ago. There was a dispersal event from Asia into Australia as our continent was getting drier. And the estimates at the moment are about 50-50. So both Hooker and Darwin can be happy. They're splitting the spoils. And it seems that about half of our flora has been here from the beginning, if you like to think of Gondwana as the beginning, and about half of it has come in more recently. So, one of the cliches of Australian botany is that, it's so unique and it's an ancient land and, we've been isolated so long. And so we know now that, that's partly true, but there's actually a lot of our flora that's come in more recently. But whatever the case, how things got here, there is a certain level of uniqueness that Surgeon Bennett made that remark about. So what is it that makes Australian plants so unique? Well, I think there's four reasons, four mechanisms, if you like, that have been key to the evolution of Australian plants. We can think about, the cliched one being aridification. Australia is a dry place, most of it is desert, and we have these deserts that really don't actually look like deserts elsewhere in the world. They're certainly as dry. Some deserts are even drier than ours. But in a sense, that's been a force of selection for certain characteristics or traits that help plants conserve water, and that's one of the features that makes Australian flora distinctive. But the next two, I think, are even more important. First of all, nutrient poverty. Most of our soils in Australia, not all of them, are extremely poor, especially in, or I shouldn't say poor, they're actually rich in terms of their flora, but they have very low levels of phosphorus in particular, and also nitrogen, potassium, and so on. And these are essential elements for plants, as anyone knows who tries to grow them will tell you. And to cope with those conditions, Australian plants have developed a number of quite important characteristics, some of which that we see quite readily, like tough leaves. It's really an upshot of low nutrient soils as much as, or perhaps more so than dryness. Okay, we often think about hard leaves as being an adaptation to dryness, but actually you can go to places where there's plenty of rainfall, like where these waratahs come from, and the leaves are still very leathery and hard, which is part of Bennett's lustre that he was referring to. So Australia's really quite unlike most other parts of the world in that sense. We have the most extensive area of very low nutrient soils. Fire is another big one. Fire occurs in most other parts of the world, but it's on steroids here in Australia and getting more so. And it's been part of the Australian landscape for at least 60 million years, and actually we know even longer than that. So it's been a major force in the evolution of the Australian flora. And I think those two factors together are really quite important and often overlooked factors in the uniqueness of the Australian flora. And then, of course, there's the isolation factor. We've been a long way from anywhere for a long time, tens of millions of years, and so that's provided some time for Australian flora to differentiate itself from its ancestral flora. And it's important to think about the sequence of these things. So the aridification actually happened much more recently than the fire or the low nutrient soils, and we see evidence of whereas a previous narrative was that the continent was once full of rainforest, which was kind of true, but there were actually the precursors of a sclerophyll flora in amongst that rainforest, we now know from more recent evidence. And it does raise the wider question of, how do all these things fit together into a narrative? And I think, the rainforests, we certainly know there's plenty of evidence that they've been around for more than 100 million years. We used to think that the sclerophyll flora was much younger than that, but now there's evidence that it's been in amongst that rainforest for at least 60 million years, possibly longer. The arid component, as I mentioned, is more recent, but still quite old. Goes back to the Miocene times. Mostly younger than about 20 million years, though, which is connected to the separation of Antarctica and the circumpolar circulation of the oceans. And getting more recently, the tropical savannas are a much more recent phenomenon, perhaps the last 10 or 12 million years. A lot of that has moved in from an influence as we got closer to Asia. The alpine herb fields are much more recent because we've only had an alpine environment, in the last couple of million years. And a lot of our alpine flora is actually derived from upward migration of plants that were already here. And wetlands are probably the youngest of the lot. It's not because necessarily there weren't wetlands for a long time, but there's such highly dynamic systems that there's a lot of turnover in the flora. And so much of our wetland flora is quite cosmopolitan, includes some genera and even species that are found in other parts of the world, as well as some unique ones. And the other point that's worth making about the past, just before we leave it, is that there's been a lot going on recently. And when you look at phylogenies like the Proteaceae, which is a very rich, there's I think 1,200 species of Proteaceae in Australia and over 300 in other parts of the world. Most of those species have actually evolved quite recently in time. So there's been a real radiation, a flush, if you like, of evolution, which is why we have so many species in these big genera that we keep putting together, Diandra and Banksia and it looks like Hakea and Grevillea as well now. So lots and lots of species in those groups, and that's because of this recent evolutionary activity. So let's move on briefly to the present day. I think, when I think about the present day, I think about people. People evolved in the last couple of million years, and they got here 60,000 years ago. So that's a long time for us, but it's actually not a very long time in evolutionary terms. And in those tens of thousands of years that people have been here, they've certainly made their presence felt in ways that we're still learning about. They lived and used various resources, and to some degree they also managed the place to make landscapes look like a certain configuration, and they influenced certainly through the use of fire and also some other structures that were built on waterways, for example. Since Europeans got here, we've got half a dozen big things happening. Habitat loss, transformation of native vegetation into parklands and buildings and pastures and croplands. We've brought huge numbers of plants here into Australia that didn't get here by any other means. We've altered disturbance regimes, and I'm thinking particularly fires and floods. But those are things that plants have evolved with. We've changed the chemical composition of soils and water, and that certainly had an influence on plants. In a few cases, there's been direct exploitation of native plant species for economic reasons. And finally, the global phenomenon of climate change. So just to give you a quick synopsis of a couple of examples there, the transformation or loss of habitat, if you like, has been quite uneven across different types of vegetation. The hummock grasslands, for example, in the centre of the country are still, largely, I won't say intact, but they're not completely lost. whereas certain kinds of forest and certainly the grassy woodlands and the grasslands are the types of vegetation and their flora that has been very substantially depleted since Europeans came here. Another big signal that's happening right at present is in terms of introduced species. There's been some inventories in the last couple of decades, and the estimates are somewhere between about 26,500 and 27,500 plant species have been brought here by people. And that's actually more than the indigenous flora of Australia, which is quite interesting. Mind you, only about a little more than 10% of those, 12-15%, are actually naturalised. So the rest are largely here in cultivation and used for various things. And the perhaps slightly disturbing thing, apart from the 3,000 or so that have already got away and are changing our ecosystems like those on the bottom in the photos there, is that there's another 6,000 that are already here that are behaving like weeds in some other part of the world, and yet they haven't yet taken off here. So whether they can actually get into Australian ecosystems or not is something that we'll find out and try to deal with as it unfolds in the coming decades. And interestingly, there's about 600 of those 24,000 native Australian species that have escaped out of their natural range because we've changed the environment and made them more suitable in other places, or moved them to places that would have been suitable if they'd have got there, but they never had until we moved them. To cap off all the grim stuff, this is the current listing of under the threatened species or biodiversity legislation at Commonwealth level, national level, and at the moment we've just cracked 1,400 plant species being listed as threatened on that list. 37 have already gone extinct. And you can see the numbers there for the other categories that indicate varying levels of closeness to the cliff of extinction, if you like to think about it that way. But I'd add that that number of extinctions of 37 documented at this point is very likely underestimated. We're conservative in what we list as extinct because we don't like to give up on things, and it is often the case that plants can be very difficult to find in the wild, even when you think you know exactly where they are. And there's a very fine example of that on the right-hand side there. That's Gentiana wismanii, which is one of 4 species, I think, in Australia, that are tiny, tiny plants. They live for less than a year, and they grow in really thick vegetation around the edges of wetlands. They're incredibly hard to find, but 2 of the 4 species in that genus haven't been seen for 25 years despite searching really hard, and this particular species is now down to 1 location when we previously knew it from somewhere like 8 or 10 locations that have recently been searched and have not found it there. So there's potentially a much greater number that are already extinct. It's just that we're not quite ready to run up the white flag on those just yet. And perhaps even more concerning is that we've lost local species locally from lots of locations, and we don't have the data on that yet. So there are species that have were formerly known from whole regions that now they're not, and that's actually a fairly difficult, involved task to bring all that data together. So to the future. There's various things, I suppose, that can happen in the future, and I guess the most common perception is that the climate's going to be different, and everything's going to move around to some degrees as it's able to, and the big question is, will this migration of flora be able to keep pace with the change in the climate, and will climate niches even sort of contract to nothing and vanish so that there's some species that no longer have a home. And to look at it that way, there's been quite a lot of work over the last 20 years in particular in Australia and globally looking at the habitat envelopes, if you like to think about that, about where plants can actually survive in landscapes. And quite a bit of attention's been focused, for example, on alpine plants, because the concern is that as the climate warms, there will be an upward migration of suitable habitat, and it could disappear off the top of the mountain, and the plants will be left in a game of musical chairs, but without a chair when the music stops. So here's one example of where some models have been used to project the future suitability of habitat for this species, Richia continentis. It's one of our native ericas that grows in sphagnum bogs at high elevation on across the snowy mountains in New South Wales and into Victoria. And the different colours there indicate, what is projected to happen. And the blue is essentially, no change. So here's a species that does retain some suitable habitat into the year 2085, but all the orange there is the habitat that becomes unsuitable. So there's a lot of places where it could currently occur that are going to become too warm and perhaps too dry for it in the future. But surprisingly for this one, there seem to be some predictions that there might be places that are now unsuitable that become suitable in the future. And I think that's a scenario that is going to be more common down in the lowlands. It's not something that you might expect to see for an alpine species. Here's another example, one of the eyebrights, again an alpine endemic, and this one only grows on the Kosciuszko Plateau. And you can see in this particular case, the projection is that the entire habitat, the entire suitable habitat will disappear. Now, the good news about these is that these models are very approximate, and often they can be wrong. And the reason they can be wrong is that sometimes plants can tolerate conditions beyond those where we actually find them growing. And in part, that's how we can grow things from, different parts of the world here in Australia. They've never been here before, and yet they can grow and thrive. And there's some 3,000 of them that have actually got away and looking after themselves. So that's the hope, that we actually have much broader envelopes of tolerance in much of the Australia flora. That's broader than what we're able to measure and use in these simple models. But there are other processes that are going on rather than just a simple warming across the whole planet. And one of the things that makes climate change both complex and interesting is that there's all kinds of interactions with other processes that can be upset by changes in the climate. And here's one example where there's been something like a 15-20% decline in annual rainfall in the southwestern corner of the Australian continent. And as a consequence of that, the Jarrah forest, which is reasonably widespread in southwestern Australia, is starting to fail in the soil types that have the lowest moisture retention capacity. And so we're seeing this dieback basically because these are trees dying from drought in the driest years. And that's not a phenomenon related to phytophthora or disease or anything. It's something that's creeping up because of climate change. Another example is a phenomenon called interval squeeze, which is a combination of two trends. One is that because of drying, plant life cycles are slowing down. It takes plants longer to develop, seeds, the capacity to grow and produce flowers and then seeds after they germinate. And at the same time, we're generating a climate that's more suitable to fires. So fires are getting closer together. And Neil Enright, who wrote this review and foreshadowed this process and was able to demonstrate that the production of flowers in this Banksia hookeriana, coincidentally, is very closely tied to the amount of rainfall in a given year. So the more rainfall there is, the more flowers it produces, and conversely, the lower the rainfall, the fewer flowers it produces, and more slowly it develops from seed. And we see that kind of interval squeeze happening right across the continent in all kinds of systems, like this alpine ash that you see that actually takes quite a long time to develop. And we've had examples where fires have recurred, quite frequently over very large areas. More than half of the entire distribution of alpine ash on mainland Australia has been burnt at least twice in the last 50 years, and we're seeing those forests being utterly transformed because of that. Similar kind of thing happening with rainforests, which are becoming flammable in ways that they weren't in previous centuries and millennia. And this is an example of a before and after of pinkwood forest up at Monga, not too far from here, where rainforest that had been burnt historically has now been comprehensively burnt, and the pinkwoods that grow there are now essentially starting again because we call it top kill. Their major stems have been killed. A fraction of the trees have been killed outright. That's about a third of them, and the remainder are setting up new stems, like this one here, which obviously are going to take a very long time to develop into major trunks again. So we can't afford to have another fire like that in that system for hundreds of years. And the probability is that there probably will be one. Sea level rise is another one that we often don't think about, but it has implications for invasion into salt marshes, squeezing the salt marsh up against the hills. And so there's quite a lot of concern about salt marsh, and of course also erosion of the coast from storm surges that are getting higher and higher and fiercer. And that has implications for littoral rainforests like this one at Royal National Park, which is quite an important little patch. Other things are happening, like shifts in flowering, which can have implications for seed set in these orchids. It's really hard to predict. Here's a couple of donkey orchids that grow together in the same place. One of them's shifting its flowering time, the other isn't. We don't really know why one is and one isn't. But in terms of the very specific insects that pollinate these flowers, they emerge at certain times of the year too, and they may not have the same kind of response to warming that the flowering does. So there could be a mismatch and slowing down of pollination. So there's a whole bunch of these processes, shifts in herbivores, and not just on land, beneath the water in the oceans as well. We're seeing major shifts in kelps and urchins that eat them. So this question about whether migration will keep pace with climate change is really quite complex, and it's very hard to come up with some generalisations that we can use to plan things to do. On the bright side, we're learning that plants have a capacity for evolution and adaptation to new environments that are much quicker than what we thought in the past. And here's an example of one of our weeds. It's Arctotheca, the cape weed, that was introduced from South Africa to Australian shores. And there's now pretty strong evidence that both genetically and morphologically, the populations in Australia are really quite different to those from which they originated in Southern Africa. So we're getting very close to the point where we've got a new species in Australia in the space of less than 80 years. So if they can do it, then maybe some other members of the Australian flora can do it too as the climate changes. And of course there's lots of effort to protect and salvage Australian flora that may not be able to persist through a bottlenecked, and that's what our meeting here is about, so I don't think I need to go into the details there. But in short, I think to wrap up, we've learned about the legacies of the past and how important they are in shaping what we've got now, the challenges of the present, and the future is really a crossroads. We could look at substantial botanical homogenisation and some losses through extinctions, but the other road is one where we can sustain a unique diversity by a combination of managing our flora in situ in its native ecosystems and having some insurance measures through ex situ combination. And I would say that for my part, a plant in the bush is worth at least two in the hand. I'll leave that with my cheeky take on the logo.
If you enjoyed this presentation, then please subscribe to our channel. Other presentations from the conference are available in this playlist, with new ones being added all the time.